Hi, I'm Jessica Montes. Thank you for all coming. So I'm a graduate from the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I graduated with my MA in 2019, and I'm currently the program administrator for the Asian American Studies program at UW. And I wanted to thank Mai for your talk because I just started in February, so learning all the history has been really great to understand how everything works. Because we do offer the Asian American Studies Certificate and the Hmong American Studies Certificate. But I'm here to introduce another Mai Elliott. Mai Elliott is the author of The Sacred Willow, 4 Generations in the Life of a Vietnamese Family, a personal and family memoir which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. Her second book, Brand in Southeast Asia, A History of the Vietnam War Era, chronicles the think tank's involvement in research about the Vietnam War at the behest of policymakers in Washington, D.C., and the impact of this involvement on RAND itself. The New Yorker magazine called her family memoir as engrossing as fine literary fiction and indispensable to understanding Vietnam and from a Vietnamese perspective. In 2016, the podcast author Malcolm Gladwell called her family memoir beautiful and her book Brand brilliant, and listed both on his podcast website as recommended readings. Mai Elliott also served as an advisor to Ken Burns' documentary, The Vietnam War, which aired on PBS in September 2017, and was featured in 7 of the 10 episodes of the film. She is a frequent speaker and writer on Vietnam. She recently contributed a chapter for Cambridge University Press 3-volume work on the Vietnam War and has completed a novel on Vietnam in the early 1960s. Mai Elliott was born in Vietnam and grew up in Hanoi and Saigon. She attended French schools in Vietnam and is a graduate of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. In this workshop, Mai Elliott will discuss issues to consider when writing a family and personal memoir. Just to note, at the time of the publication in 2000, most books on the Vietnam War were predominantly male and from a military perspective. Mai's memoir was one of the first few books written from a Vietnamese, a local woman's perspective, not only about the Vietnam War, but the Vietnamese family at the core. So this was truly an inspiration for me when I was writing my MA thesis. So it's my honor to welcome Mai Elliott.
Sorry, it's challenging. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I understand that some of you have considered assigning memoirs to your students. Maybe you've thought of writing your own memoir. You've thought of encouraging your students who come from varied backgrounds to write their own memoirs. At any case, I'm going to talk to you about the process I went through to put my family story together. And I hope that when you understand the process, you'll see what a writer of memoirs goes through and what is it that he or she is trying to achieve. What points does she or he want to get across? So this is what I learned myself, because when I started, I had no idea really how to do this. But these are the decisions I had to make, the issues I faced. So I'm just going to share them with you. They're not the end-all and be-all of memoir writing, but I hope that you find them interesting, maybe even helpful. So the first decision I had to make was to define my goal. What is it that I wanted to write? Did I just want to write something for my own family, like a record to keep, to pass along? Or did I want to get it published? And I definitely wanted to get it published. So that defining my goal helped me write my book, because if I were to write for my family, I could just throw in all the stories, string them together without analysis, without interpretation, without explanation, without having to provide a context or anything. And but if I had wanted to publish it, I would have to put together a more compact, a more coherent narrative, and I would have to leave out details, stories that might be of interest to my own family, but could slow down the narrative, bore the readers to tears, for example. So the definition of your goal is very important. So the next issue I had to face was, what was the purpose of this book? Defining the purpose that you want to achieve helped you shape your book. In my case, I surveyed the literature at the time in America, in English, about the Vietnam War. And I realized that there was a gap, a big gap, that had not been covered. At the time, there was something like 6,000 books that had been published about the Vietnam War. Most of them dealt with the American experience in Vietnam. Soldiers going there, it was like a rite of passage for them. The impact that the war had on the US, on Vietnam, on American foreign relations in general, relations with the Soviet Union, China, whatever you name it. And the books that dealt with the Vietnamese mostly talked about the role of the peasants. Now that is very understandable, because the peasants in Vietnam represented 80% of the population, and they played a crucial role in both wars. The war for the independence against the French that lasted 9 years, and during the Vietnam War. So that's very understandable. But the gap is that most of the book glossed over or did not mention at all the role of the middle class. My family was from the middle class. And that is kind of, not deplorable, but kind of sad, because the middle class played a very important role during both wars against the French and during the Vietnam War. A lot of the leaders came from the middle class, and in the case of South Vietnam, the middle class was very important, because they were like a bulwark against the expansion of communism. They had the most to lose in a communist victory. And the United States, right at the beginning, understood that the middle class would be very helpful in keeping the communists at bay, and would provide the much needed support for the government in Saigon. So the United States actually helped strengthen, expand the middle class in Vietnam. So the purpose of my own book would be to tell the story of the middle class and the role. And then I would use the story of my own family as a stand-in for the middle class at large in Vietnam. So although my family might be different from the other middle class in some respect, they lived through the same events, they followed the same traditions and customs, and they shared the same values. So, but above all, although the decisions they made might differ, they were faced with the same choices in the two wars, whether to join the communist side or the non-communist side, or to stay on the sideline. It's complicated, so I wrote it down, so bear with me. So the next decision I had to make was how far back to take this family history, what the timeline would be. So this is when the definition of the purpose of my book came in handy. Since the focus was on the two wars that shaped Vietnamese history and my family's role in these two wars, it made sense for me to take the story back to the beginning, to the event that eventually triggered the two wars. And that original event was the French conquest of Vietnam in the 19th century, which turned Vietnam into a French colony for 80 years. So The reason I took it all the way back to the French conquest was French colonialism triggered the war for independence. And the group that eventually led the fight against the French and won was a group called the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader. So then the communists won, took over half of Vietnam, the north. The south remained non-communist, and the United States, during the Cold War, wanted to keep South Vietnam from being absorbed by the communist bloc. And the United States intervened, and we came to the Vietnam War. And that's why I took it all the way back to the French conquest. And since the French conquest coincided with the lifetime of my great-grandfather, then that made it easy. I'm going to talk about my great-grandfather first. But then the long arc of French colonialism, the Cold War, the communist victory and revolution, and the Vietnam War encompass the lifetime of my grandfather, my father, and my siblings. So that's why I ended up writing about 4 generations in my family. So the story of the 4 generations is interwoven with the key events in Vietnamese history, starting with the French conquest and ending with the communist victory in the Vietnam War in 1975 and the aftermath of that victory on my family and on Vietnam in general. And then I decided, in that case, I would write about what these events were, how they affected my family, what choices and decisions they forced my family to make, and the unforeseen consequences of these choices. And since these events also transformed Vietnamese society, I would show as well how the changes transformed the internal dynamics of my family. So the next question is, what are the themes of this book? Since this is going to be a family story above all, the main themes of my book would be the importance of the family in Vietnamese culture, the dilemma that they face when choosing between the interests of the family and the survival of the family against the interests of society as a whole, and the dynamics of the family as it went about trying to preserve itself and its values. Lastly, another theme is the resilience of the family bonds that were tested by war and revolution. So once I've chosen themes, I had to pick from the trove of stories I had gathered, the ones that were not only most interesting and compelling, but also the ones that could best illustrate the themes of my book and the points I wanted to make. These stories would also have to be woven into a coherent narrative, which in turn would tell a larger story so that the sum would be greater than its parts. That is to say that the stories about my family would in turn tell the larger story of Vietnam in colonial time, during the Communist Revolution, and during the Cold War. So my next question that I posed to myself was, who am I going to write this for? So I decided to write for the general American audience, including Vietnamese Americans who might want to know more about aspects of Vietnam they might not know about. So this decision led me to write my book in the form of a narrative. If I had chosen to write this for academics, scholars, I would have written a more drier book, more academic, less personal. But what my book ended up doing was that it attracted both audiences. The academics, the scholars found it a good source of history about the events in Vietnam. And some of them have assigned my book to their courses. And the audience would read my book as, a family story. so my book could be read on 2 levels. So that was that's what I did not expect, but that's what happened. So then, since I decided to address my book to a general audience, I thought a chronological narrative would make sense. This way, a general reader could follow the complicated events and stories more easily. So deciding on what audience you were writing for would help you choose the approach for your book. So these are the key decisions I had to make even before I started to write. So the next thing, when I decided to sit down and write, I had to take stock of what information I had. So I had interviewed many relatives, including my father, my mother, and I had heard enough stories over the year to have a base of information. But there were many gaps in my family story that you had to fill. So I embarked on a long period of research by interviewing more relatives, collecting family photos and documents, digging in archives and libraries, and reading a lot of books. I cast a wide net because I thought it would be better to have more information than less. A detail, an anecdote might not seem important, but might turn out to be crucial in illuminating my story. So I'm going to switch about the technicalities in writing that I faced. One issue I had to face was to provide the context of my stories. So unless the reader understands what was happening around my family, he or she would have trouble understanding the decisions that my family faced and the choices they made, and the ramifications of these choices, as well as the changing relationships within my family. For example, as Confucianism, which is very strong in Vietnam, eroded with the introduction of French culture, the role of men and women in the family changed. So this context helped the reader understand not only why my family did what they did, but also what motivated them. In short, this context formed the background of the tapestry of my family story. So another thing I had to keep in mind is that I could not assume that the reader would understand what I'm referring to. So I had to explain as I went along. For example, what did I mean when I talk about the 4 tenets of Confucianism? But I also had to keep in mind that I would have to maintain continuity and coherence and avoid repetition. Since my book covered a century of history, I had to remember not to repeat something I had mentioned in chapter 5, for example, in another chapter. And I also had to keep in mind that the ramifications of a decision made by somebody, my father, for example, did not manifest themselves until several chapters later. So this became more important as I went back and forth to edit. I had to remember that if I cut something out in an early chapter, I should not mention something relating to it in another chapter. So another issue I grapple with is the complexity is a part of life. Things are not black and white. No one is perfect. Truth, in short, is complex. So I try to resist the temptation to gloss over unpleasant truths and to present characters with their strengths and weaknesses. And I try to depict events in their complexities to capture the unpredictable nature of history as well as the irony of life. You can never predict what's going to happen. So not only is this, I think, the right way to tell the story, but it also makes the story more interesting. So I cast a wide net when I finally sat down to write. I wrote a lot of stories because I didn't know at the beginning how my book would come together in the end. Who knows? A story that might sound trivial or a detail that might seem unimportant might shed light on something later or give insight into the motivation of someone in my family. So to begin each chapter, I look for an anecdote or a description of someone that is not only compelling, intriguing, or insightful, but can also draw the readers in. It also has to set the stage for the stories and events that are going to be covered in that chapter. So last but not least, I learned that I had to keep writing and not get discouraged by the enormity of my task. A blank stage staring you in your face is very intimidating. So I had to motivate myself constantly. There were times when I hit the writer's block, but I learned that if I just sat down and started writing, ideas and words began to flow. What I wrote could be uninteresting, incoherent, bad in general, but the main thing was just to keep going, because I could always go back and rewrite and trim later. So, last thing I want to say is, if you want to write your own memoir, if you want to encourage someone you know, your students to write a memoir, the main thing is just to get going. It's just to get started and keep going. So, I think that's all I have to say about the process of writing a memoir. And I hope, if you have questions, please let me know. I hope you find, if you decide to write, I hope you find all this at least helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have lots of time for questions for the whole process of writing memoirs, having students read memoirs, and how to incorporate this form into your curriculum, but also the refugee memoirs in particular form.
In California, there's for several summers there were workshops for high school teachers, and they were teaching about Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and they wanted to incorporate memoirs in the curriculum, because memoirs are easier for the students to absorb history, right? It's not a compendium of facts and events, but it's a family story, and it's very easy to follow and absorb and remember events and so on. So they had workshops for a couple of summers, and I was invited to talk about my memoir. And so I think it's a useful tool if you're teaching history. Or even if, because in my book I talk a lot about social evolution, so it's a topic, it's about how events influence society, transform it, and so on. That could be also a useful thing to use for that purpose. So anyway, do you have questions? Yes?
Thank you for telling us a little bit about how these things sort of come together, right? I feel like we never sort of get to hear the story behind how the books are put together, so thank you for that. I had a question about sort of your conversations with publishers and editors and sort of how they guided you in their notes to you and what you found helpful, and then how do you sort of sort out what your voice is among the voices of what the publishing world might want and what the editorial world might want. Because I think the question of sort of knowledge production, right, is really interesting, and how does, you sort of navigate all of that while sort of maintaining the goal that you wanted in the beginning, right, and how did that sort of carry through, and what levels of mediation and what sort of I don't know, compromises you might have had to make, and what was your guiding light, right, while you were trying to sort through all the stuff that folks were sort of giving you notes on?
Yeah, so my first task was to find an agent, because without an agent you don't have much of a chance of getting through to a publisher. At that time I was told that the publisher on average got about 6,000 manuscripts a year, and there's no way they would plow through all that. So they depended in general on agents. Agents are like the first triage. So agents would pick the best books that they felt would sell. Basically, this is the business, right? So then they would talk to publishers, and they help you open doors. So in my case, my agent helped me land Oxford University Press. And then Oxford University Press assigned an editor who knew nothing about Vietnam, or I don't think he knew very much, but he was very good. So, and I submitted a huge manuscript because I was told not to try to self-edit, because an editor might find something interesting in the stories that I included. So this editor helped me cut it down. So what he would do was he would mark this red X's, and then I basically had to rewrite, because every time you cut out something, you have to rewrite the transition from this paragraph to the next. You have to remember that, oh, hey, chapter 20, I talked about something that he just axed, you know. So so it was really rewriting with his guidance, and he helped me trim phrases, sentences, and we saw eye to eye. I had no trouble with him, and he understood very well that not to smother my voice and make it his own book. So it ended up being my book, and with his guidance. And I have no trouble with this process. I know that there are authors who had to fight with their editors because they didn't see eye to eye. But in my case, it went very smoothly, and I'm eternally grateful to him because he was so good. That was the process I went through. Yeah, I was just lucky, I guess, to get the right editor. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mai, for sharing. I imagine with the preparation and the research, the background that you did to prepare for the book, there was a lot of information that you amassed. You talked a little bit about it yesterday, so I've heard about that very laborious process. And I'm curious, out of all the information that you were able to gather, this goes back to the previous question that we were just talking about, how much material ended up not being included in the final product that is in your notes, that's in your memory, that might be shared with family members, but did not make it into the actual book itself?
Yes. Well, there were many stories that I found interesting, but in the end, didn't keep might slow down the narrative. And I think that's one of the decisions you have to make is, does the inclusion of this story slow down the narrative? And you want to keep it flowing, you want to keep the readers reading and not get bogged down in too many stories and details. So there were some stories about my grandfather, for example, that I ended up not including, or my editor suggested not including. So it's a long process, and it's also a decision that you have to make yourself, and your editor helps you make. Cutting is just as painful as writing, you know, because you know, oh, this is such an interesting story, but you have to exercise some self-discipline, I think, because you can end up with something sprawling and people get bogged down, and so and it's a subjective decision, you know. You think you should include this, but who knows? Somebody else might be interested in it. So I think it's a process that there's really no guidance that you have to make yourself, considering the overall nature of your book and what is it that you want to get across. I think in the end it's very subjective. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for doing it. Yes?
I was thinking from a perspective of an educator who might be considering, you know, assigning a memoir writing task or assignment to their class. From your perspective, you know, talking to previous generations, family members, trying to, talk about events or relationships that have, varying amounts of trauma attached to them, and how to negotiate those difficult conversations. What advice would you offer to help kind of guide that assignment or help guide, an educator who's, possibly going to task their students with this type of writing? From your own experience working with your family, how did you negotiate those difficult conversations?
In the case of my family, they basically trusted me, trust. They know that I wasn't going to sensationalize it, that I would tell the stories that they happen, but not trying to make it sensational, just to get it published. So, so trust, I think, is very important when you sit down with your family. And as far as assigning it to your students, I think, these are all very traumatic events, and I don't think there's any way of going around it. Students, I don't know what students are like now, but in my generation, we learn all sorts of things, and we didn't end up being traumatized by what we read. It was difficult, but life, it's life. War, revolution, these are not easy periods to live through. And this is just the things that happen. And what happened to my family is nothing compared to what happened to peasants who lived in the countryside, the crucible of wars. So, in a way, my family is not as hard to read as the stories of people who were really caught in the fighting. Families killed, homes destroyed, and so on. So the trauma we experience is nothing compared to the trauma of other people. And I didn't hear anything from the teachers in California who assigned my book. I think one teacher assigned, they might not assign the whole book, but they might assign chapters. And I don't know what chapter. One teacher assigned a chapter about my grandmother, who was owned a silk store in Hanoi in the early 20th century. Another teacher assigned a chapter about me growing up in Saigon and being introduced to American culture, pop culture, and how I fell in love with it. So I don't know what the purposes were, but they seem to assign different chapters. A professor at Harvard assigned a chapter about the famine in North Vietnam in 1945. So I think it depends on their own curriculum, their own agenda, what they choose to assign, because assigning the whole book to high school students would be too much, because it's 500 pages, Yeah. So you might go through and decide, this is an interesting chapter about colonialism. What happened when a colonial power took over a country? How did that transform a country, a society? Or you might decide that, at the end of the war, after the Americans withdrew and the communists took over, what happened? Why did people end up in the United States? So, it depends on what it is that you try to convey to students or get them to learn more about, So it's very much depends on your own purpose, because it's 100 years of history. It covers so many aspects. As I'm fond of telling people, each chapter that I write could be the topic of a PhD dissertation. You talk about French conquest, that could be a whole dissertation, for example. So, yes.
Mai, thanks again. Of course, I heard you yesterday, but I wanted to add a little note. I've told Mary this already. As a librarian, there's one book about the Hmong. It's not a memoir, but it's called simply The Hmong, written in 2007 by Greenhaven Press in the Coming to America series. It was edited by somebody, back to the point of editor, who didn't necessarily do her homework well, because there's inaccurate information in there. Not throughout, not everything is wrong, but there's some things that are just totally incorrect. And you, the teachers, wouldn't necessarily know that. And I contacted the publisher at the time, and they said, oh, thank you, but they weren't going to like send out an errata slip to put in the books that still hadn't been sold. So that information, that incorrect information is out there, and it's just, unfortunately, you know, not known by the average teacher or the student who might be reading their book.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to point that out because it just happened that I actually looked at that book. I can't look at every book I get into the library system, but in that case, it was a simple book. I thought, oh, this is a nice basic book. I can tell people about it, and I realized, wait a minute, this is incorrect, and that's incorrect, and so they, you know. I just wanted to mention that it related to the editing, right, in that context. So again, it's The Hmong, 2007, by Greenhaven Press.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Oxford University Press, they also have like a fact check. They fact check, especially dates and so on. So that was very helpful. Yeah,
This book needed some of that.
yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, yes. Amy, yes.
So you said that you decided to write the book because of the gap that you saw in stories about the Vietnam War from the middle class perspective. What sparked you to say, to be like, oh, I can do this, I can write this story, I can invest all of this time and work and effort into doing this? What made you believe that you could be the author of this book?
Yeah, you know, I thought of writing my family story, but not to the extent that I ended up doing. But when I was a teenager growing up in Saigon, I would listen to stories my parents told, and I said, especially my father, I said, Dad, you should write a book about all this. And he said, my gosh, who's going to read this, you know? So, so it's something I wanted to write. But yeah, it took a lot of naivete, I guess, to decide that, yeah, I'm going to do this and it will get published. So it's just something I wanted to do. It was a labor of love. And I decided if nobody published it, it would be fine. I would still have captured my family history. And writing is something that I've always wanted to do. And it's a dream deferred, like I was talking to you at the lunch table. You know, you want to write, and because of the demands of your life, you know, career, children, family, you have to defer it. But it's a dream that didn't die with me. So I just wanted to do it, so I sat down and did it. And no matter what would happen, you know, like I said, if I got published, fine. If not, fine too, you know. So I was just lucky. Yeah, I was very lucky. Yes. Yes.
So continuing our conversation from our table, we wish we had known more. We just said, oh my God, we didn't know we were sitting with greatness. No, it's so nice to have you here. But, you know, looking at the creative writing process or the writing process, or having a banking background going into writing, you know, how did you begin that process of learning to write narrative and memoir? I mean, you're obviously well read, but did you have any other influences or sources to begin the creative writing process, or other memoirs you looked to, for example?
Well, I came from a family of poets, for example. So in traditional Vietnamese society, poetry is considered the highest form of art. Right? So my great-grandfather was a poet, my grandfather was a poet, my father tried to be a poet, but it's not very good. But so it kind of ran in the family. I had a lot of aunts and so on who could write poetry. And so it kind of ran in the family. And I went to French school, and the French really not insisted, but emphasized writing. So I would have to, for example, I don't remember the level that I was at, but after a vacation, for example, they would say write a composition, you know, an essay about what you did during the summer. What was your vacation like? Describe it. Or they would say, you take a walk in the forest, describe it. So I kind of learned how to write in French school. Of course, I read a lot of French books that were assigned to me, you know, all the great writers of French literature, Corneille, Racine, Flaubert, you mentioned it, I read and read. And then during the Vietnam War, my husband was drafted and sent to Vietnam, and he was not assigned to a fighting unit. But after he is discharged, he stayed in Vietnam and did research. And we lived in a small town with no entertainment. So I had nothing to do but read. And I read extensively. I read Hemingway, I read Faulkner, I read Sunset Mom. So I think I was influenced by French and American English writers. So I think all that just kind of came together. And like I said, I was naive enough to think that I could do it. So, sometimes it's just like chutzpah, you just think, well, I'm going to do it and I'm going to make it, So you have to just believe that it's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's fine, because it's a process you enjoy anyway. You like writing, and, so writing is a pleasure. It doesn't matter what happens, right? Yes?
Do you have time for just one more question? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you use the real names, or how do you deal with that?
Good question, thank you. I faced that issue. Do I write under the name I'm known under now, my married name, Mai Elliott, or I write under my Vietnamese name, which is Dung Van Mai Elliott. Dung Van Mai. And I decided to use at first my Vietnamese name, because I thought Americans looking at my name, if I wrote under the name of Mai Elliott, they would think, oh, it's an American who writes about Vietnam. What does she know, So I thought if I use my Vietnamese name, it would sound more authentic. But it's become a problem because my name is so hard, Vietnamese name is so hard to remember. So I've switched to both Mai Elliott and Dung Van Mai Elliott. It doesn't matter. Whoever calls me Mai, I respond. So. Yes, that's a good question. So you have to decide what name you want to use. So my nom de plume could be Dung Van Mai, could be Dung Van Mai Elliott, Mai Elliott. Yes, I think that's the last question.
Yeah, but everybody can reach all of the speakers through me and just in general. So again, this is not the end of the conversation. I'm just going to move things along a little bit so we continue to have time for the rest of our talks today. But thank you very much. Okay, so we have a refreshment break on the agenda. So why don't we just do about a 5-minute break or so, and then we'll